Welcome to another episode of the Payment Strategy Show. I am Joshua Silver, founder and CEO of Rainforest. This is a bit of a bonus episode. I've invited Colin Luce back to talk with us today about agentic commerce. We didn't have time in our last podcast where we were talking about vaulting and orchestration, but we just started to touch on it. And I think it's an interesting enough topic and an emerging topic right now that I wanted to pull Colin back in for a few minutes so we could have a quick conversation on it. Colin, for anyone who might not have heard our last episode, tell us a little bit about agentic commerce, and then I want to offer some thoughts as well.
I think when we talk about agentic commerce, what we're really talking about is empowering these AI agents to transact on our behalf. Now, underneath that, there's a lot to unpack around identity, authorization, intent, all these different things. But fundamentally, that's it. I think the other thing we touched on, which maybe we can expand on here, is just the nuanced difference between agentic commerce and commerce inside of AI-enabled ecosystems. I think ChatGPT launched their initial shopping feature set a few weeks ago, and that's very much just an extension of what we're seeing with TikTok and Instagram and stuff. But I think they have much broader ambitions to go down this path of truly agentic payments, but I don't think we're there yet.
And where do you think it ultimately ends? And not maybe in a 10-year time horizon, but do you think in a year or 2 years, Colin, that we'll have agents doing most of our shopping for us? And if so, what types of things do you think they'll be buying versus relying still on humans to go make those purchases?
So a couple things. I actually think very few things are going to be fully automated with agentic commerce and these AIs transacting on our behalf. I think there is a middle ground, and not even from a time horizon, but just from a behavioral and reality perspective where there's going to be a human in the loop. I actually think agentic commerce is going to be a lot more about accelerating efficiency and reducing downtime or wasted time in the overall buying experience, as opposed to just being truly automated and truly outsourced to these agents. That said, I do think there's a subset of things like subscriptions that are going to be fully outsourced or automated to these AI agents. You know, Visa had their big product drop. I can't remember if it was last week or the week before. And they had Sarah Fryer on from OpenAI talking about this. And she compared it to like, she still enjoys going to the mall and shopping with her daughter, less about the actual shopping, but the time and the bonding and stuff. And that's going to continue to exist. But the toothpaste and the toilet paper that you just want delivered to your house every other Friday, like that should be automated. I think everywhere in between, it's just going to be this accelerated, more efficient buying process, but still very human in the loop.
Yeah, I look at it as a couple different categories. I think there's that basic purchases, we're out of eggs and milk and we need to buy those on a certain frequency. I mean, we've had that for a long time. We even had smart refrigerators that could kind of keep an eye on things. I think those actually will progress quite a bit and you'll just won't run out of the basic staples and commodities. So I actually don't think we're that far away from that. I think the big challenge is going to be on getting the data, right? Would you trust your credit card to an agent, agentic commerce bot that was going to go buy your groceries? I think a lot of people would say, yeah, it's not a super high risk purchase. I'm a pretty routine creature. I know what I like and use it with some regularity in terms of consumption. So I think there's that, but then there's also unlocking new types of buying experiences. And one of my favorite examples here is travel. I may have a long weekend and say over Memorial Day weekend, I want to take a trip. It's kind of endless, the possibilities there, right? I could fly. I live in Atlanta. We can fly many places nonstop. And you look at what's the time as a constraint. What are the hotels? What are the car rentals? What's the transportation? What are all these things? Today, there's a lot of pieces, and it's more than just Expedia saying, here's a package of a hotel and a flight. There's a lot more that goes into it. I think we'll get to a point relatively quickly where AI can put together, here's a list of 4 sample trips that are completely different. It's end-to-end turnkey. Which one do you want? Yeah. And so it may enable making purchases that don't really exist today or are hard. Or you may say, I want to go to a concert and see a jazz musician in the next 6 months. And it will put together itineraries for you with ticket availability and combining all these different things in novel ways that, is very manually intensive today. So I think it might unlock just new forms of packages, trips, more complex purchases. You're buying a car, it can look at all the different features and matrix them out for you, knowing your lifestyle.
Yeah.
Curious if you have thoughts on the different types of purchases, ranging from really basic staples in your fridge to hyper complex international trips.
Yeah. No, look, I think it's interesting that you call that out as an example. I mean, that literally was the example Visa used in their product drop. Less the here's 4 different trips, but hey, I need to go to Miami. I want to go to Miami sometime in the next month. Look at my calendar. Tell me what weekends are open. Look at flights. Look at hotels. What activities there are, et cetera, et cetera. And I think that's totally a viable direction this goes. I think the other angle to consider here is the modality in which we interact with these AIs.
Mm.
And the example there being like, I was in Target the other day and I was looking for something and they were out of stock. And I had my AirPods in. And so I pulled up ChatGPT and I said, hey, can you check to see if the Best Buy 3 blocks away has this in stock? And they did. Imagine if I had a stored payment credential in ChatGPT there and I said, great, can you go ahead and buy that for me and then have it ready for me to pick up when I get over there? And so I think if we truly transition to this like voice modality in the real world, there's some really interesting unlocks there. But again, it goes back to my previous point, like the example I just gave there, and frankly, the example you gave is more about accelerated efficiency and getting time back as opposed to necessarily opening up net new opportunities or whatever. And so I guess I think about it from like, how much like incremental GMV are we really talking about here? How much incremental net new spend are we talking about? And for sure, maybe your laziness would preclude you, not that you're actually lazy, I know you're not, but like maybe your perceived laziness in this example would preclude you from going on that trip absent of the AI doing it for you, sure. But I also know that you need your vacation releases. And so you'd find a way to like find time to go book that trip. That's the perspective that I look at it from in a lot of these different cases.
Yeah, so I think the question still remains, is there a GMV expansion or is it just really a time savings process?
You touched on something really important there, which is like this idea of trusting this AI agent to go get groceries for you. I think the question is, what are the guardrails in place for that, right? And I've heard a few different approaches here. Do we attach a one-time use virtual card with preset spending limits around it? Can we actually go down to the LLM layer, and are they, not hallucinating enough where we can put the controls in there? I heard someone say around authorization that they would potentially like give this agent power of attorney to avoid like, and I'm like, get out of here. There's no way, right? And so again, there's a lot of questions around authorization, intent, guardrails, trust, like these big concepts.
Yeah. This obviously is the payment strategy show. So let's talk a little bit about what does it actually take to make this work in reality? Because clearly there's a whole AI layer of, and I think this, in my opinion, this is actually the hardest part is how do you get the input data, right? Like get back to the travel example, how are you getting access to the person's calendar and to the availability of the inventory? And, there's like 7 data pieces that they need to get, even in your example of telling Siri, go buy, or telling ChatGPT, go find me this product. Does ChatGPT even know exactly what product you're talking about, the exact right specifications, the brand, the size, all those things? So I think there's actually an input
Yeah.
data problem that's really challenging. But beyond that, what are the mechanics that need to happen for this agent to go make those purchases? I mean, in some ways, Visa and MasterCard have pretty consumer-friendly rules on returns and purchases and chargebacks and things that, there's always some guardrails. To some extent, would you feel comfortable just saying, here's my non-tokenized regular old pan, go buy me some stuff?
Yeah. Yeah, but then there we have this question of associated PCI compliance, and is that on OpenAI or Siri or who handles that? And so, yeah, I think, look, from a payments perspective, the big question is around form field input versus tokens versus wallets here. And there's going to be trade-offs between ubiquity, extensibility, and time here. And if I were to guess how this plays out, I would guess that the various different players looking at this ecosystem will actually start with platforms because, to your point, They need to be able to get to inventory data, SKU level stuff, like stuff that only a platform would have. I think the very biggest of the big merchants will be hand combat, one by one, whale hunting. And then, as with everything in life, it's a question of how we go after the long tail, right? So I think platforms will be first, large merchants as well, and then there's a long tail question here. My hunch is this plays out to look somewhat like the digital wallets on our phones, Google Pay and Apple Pay. There's going to be the equivalent of an agentic wallet infrastructure play with various different underlying credentials in there, whether those are cards, whether those are bank accounts, whether those are APMs. But that's my hunch on how this plays out.
And I think it's interesting to note historically with some of these new innovations, we've really fallen back to the least common denominator in most cases. If you look at Apple Pay or Google Pay, we could have created a non-format preserving token of some type that the networks just accepted. But no, what do they do behind the scenes? Apple Pay and Google Pay are in general having a format preserving number that gets transmitted through legacy systems so that all of the ubiquitous systems out there are compatible. We saw the same thing with when buy now, pay later came out. In order to not have to integrate into the checkout processes of every retailer, a lot of buy now, pay later solutions created one-time virtual use cards to shove into the form fields of that retailer, and the retailer didn't know anything different, that it was really a buy now, pay later transaction. So in some ways, we're still beholden to the United States position as first mover in developing the card networks, and we've got all this legacy infrastructure. And so I know MasterCard talked about we're getting rid of PANs, at least in Europe, by 2030. I think the US might be a lot later than that when you look at how long it takes us to adopt things. So we'll see how much we can leapfrog with agentic commerce into new arenas versus we're still falling back to legacy constructs like single one-time use virtual cards or format preserving tokens, things like that.
Yeah, look, show me the incentive, I'll show you the outcome, right? And I think the hope here is there's never been a company to grow and accrue as much value in as short of a time period as OpenAI and ChatGPT and some of these things. And can they use that weight to actually go break down barriers versus, to your point, fall back to least common denominators?
Lots of areas for expansion, certainly. So, Colin, one other thing before we wrap. Historically, the card networks have been really consumer friendly with regard to chargebacks and disputes. If you say, I didn't buy this, in general, it goes in your favor, and then the merchant has to prove that you actually did buy it or whatever the circumstances were. How do you think things are going to change with agentic commerce? Because all of a sudden, maybe it isn't you who's making that purchase. Maybe it's your agent, or maybe the agent hallucinated and went rogue and bought something that you didn't expect. How do you think the networks are going to have to evolve some of these rules in light of agentic commerce coming on?
So I think it's a great question, and probably one of the most fundamental questions in all of this. And I think part of the reason it doesn't get talked about enough is because we all want to drive innovation forward, and hard questions like this just give people a pause. Beyond that, it kind of goes back to my earlier point, which is I actually think these things are going to have to return back to some sort of human in the loop with intent confirmation that says, okay, we know you wanted us to go book this Jazz Fest trip for you. Here's everything. I just want to triple confirm. Here is the breakdown between the hotel amount, the flight amount, the ticket festival amount, the bus trip to their amount. Please confirm all four of these transactions. That doesn't necessarily solve the underlying, is it you empowering this? But I think it gets a lot closer to what we're seeing today. And I think the hope is, again, that if the modality of our interactions with these AI agents and agentic commerce happens from our mobile device, can we continue to lean on biometrics and things like that to confirm all of this? But again, I think it speaks directly to why I think there's going to be some sort of human in the loop aspect here.
It's also interesting, I think, to think about the back end of the chargeback and dispute process, because you're ultimately going to have merchants using AI to respond to disputes in a very highly productive and detailed way. I have no doubt you're also going to have consumer-facing applications that allow you to file disputes more easily and provide compelling evidence. And quite frankly, I think the network may insert AI as an arbiter in the middle to try to figure out that. And so I think we're in for some big changes there. Certainly, we've seen that on the fraud side of synthetic fraud identities being created, having to play cat and mouse. I think we're going to see something similar in chargebacks as well, but time will tell.
Yeah, now I'm thinking about what a like AI court looks like, and maybe it happens in the metaverse. What if we do AI court in the metaverse?
Time will tell. Colin Luce, appreciate you being on the show. Colin is co-founder and CEO of Basis Theory. Thanks for being with us.
Thank you.